On the morning of August 18, 1590, a man named John White waded through the surf onto a thin spit of sand off the coast of what we now call North Carolina, climbed a low rise of dunes, and found a single word carved into a wooden post. 5 letters, cut deep into the stripped pale wood with a knife. CROATOAN. Behind that post stood the skeleton of a settlement, a square palisade of felled trees, the bones of houses taken apart plank by plank, English chests dug up out of the sand, pried open and left to rot in the rain. And around all of it, nothing. No voices, no smoke from a cooking fire, no bodies, no graves. 115 men, women, and children had lived on this island 3 years before. One of them was White's own daughter. One of them was his granddaughter, a little girl named Virginia who, if she was still breathing somewhere out beyond those trees, was turning 3 years old on the exact day her grandfather stood on that beach trying to read a word he did not fully understand. They were all gone, every last one of them. And in the 4 centuries since, nobody has ever proven what happened to them. Here is the part that should bother you. This was not a shipwreck. It was not a single boat lost in a storm where the sea swallows the evidence and the question dies with the crew. This was an entire town. People who built houses and dug wells and planted gardens and gave birth and held funerals. People with names we still know: Ananias Dare, Eleanor Dare, George Howe, Dionysus Harvey, Roger Bailey. People who left behind a fortified compound and a careful, deliberate clue carved at eye level, and then walked off the edge of the historical record so completely that we cannot even agree on which direction they went. We have spaceflight. We have mapped the human genome. We can read the chemistry of stars that died before the Earth existed. And we still cannot tell you with certainty what became of the first English children born in America. That gap, that silence, has been gnawing at people for over 400 years, and the closer you look, the worse it gets. So let me take you back to the beginning, because the disappearance is only the last act of a much darker story. And to understand how 115 people could simply evaporate, you have to understand why they were standing on that God-forsaken sandbar in the first place. In the 1580s, England was the poor cousin of Europe. Spain was the superpower. Spanish galleons were dragging the looted wealth of 2 continents, silver from the mountains of Peru, gold from Mexico, back across the Atlantic in convoys so heavy they rode low in the water. Spain had cities in the New World while England had nothing but cold ambition and a queen, Elizabeth I, who badly wanted a piece of it. She could not afford open war, not yet, so she did the next best thing. She licensed pirates. They were called privateers, which is just a polite legal word for a robber with a royal permission slip, and the most dazzling of them, a courtier named Sir Walter Raleigh, came to her with a plan that was equal parts greed and genius. Plant an English colony on the coast of North America. Use it as a forward base. From there, English ships could lunge out at the Spanish treasure fleet sailing home through the Caribbean, strike and slip back to a friendly harbor before the Spanish Navy could respond. The colony was never really about farming. It was a pirate fortress dressed up as a settlement. And that original sin, that it was a military gamble first and a community a distant second, runs underneath everything that followed. In 1584, Raleigh sent 2 captains, Philip Amadas and Arthur Barlow, across the Atlantic to scout. They came back glowing. They described a land of fat deer and grapevines so thick they grew right down to the water, of soil that seemed to produce without effort, of people who greeted them with feasts and gifts. The natives were Algonquian-speaking peoples, the CROATOAN, the CROATOAN, the Roanoke, living in towns of barcandreed houses up and down the barrier islands and the mainland sounds. And here Barlow wrote a line that should make the hair on your neck stand up, knowing what we know now. He called these people gentle, loving, and faithful, living after the manner of the Golden Age. The English would spend the next 3 years systematically destroying that goodwill, and the survivors of their own arrogance would pay the price. The captains brought 2 native men back to England with them, Manteo from the CROATOAN island to the south and Wanchese from Roanoke itself. Remember those 2 names. They are about to become the 2 poles of this entire tragedy. Manteo would stay loyal to the English to the end. Wanchese would see, very clearly and very early, exactly what these pale strangers were, and he would turn against them with a cold and total fury. The English put these 2 men on display in London, paraded them at court, dressed them in taffeta, and taught them English so they could serve as guides and interpreters. They had no idea they were also handing one of those men a complete education in their own weaknesses. The first real colony sailed in 1585. This was not a town. This was an army. Around 100 men, almost all soldiers and adventurers, under the command of a hard, suspicious military governor named Ralph Lane, escorted by Raleigh's cousin, the violent and imperious Sir Richard Grenville. They landed at Roanoke Island, threw up an earthwork fort and some houses, and settled in to wait for the treasure ships they intended to plunder. And right away, almost immediately, the whole thing started to curdle. It started over a silver cup. During the early exploration, the English visited a native town called Aquascagok, and afterward they discovered a silver cup was missing. They believed the townspeople had stolen it. Grenville's response tells you everything about the men who came to civilize this coast. He sent a party back, and when the cup was not returned to his satisfaction, they burned the entire town to the ground and torched the standing corn that the people there needed to survive the winter. Over a cup. The English had been on that coast for a matter of weeks, and they had already shown their new neighbors that the penalty for crossing them was starvation and fire. Now the stakes climbed, because the English had a problem they had engineered themselves. They were soldiers, not farmers. They had not planted nearly enough food. They were utterly dependent on the native towns to feed them through the winter, and they had just announced in the most violent terms available that they were dangerous, demanding guests. The local paramount chief, a man named Wingina, who at some point changed his own name to Pemasapan, possibly a sign of his own shifting plans, watched his people's food stores draining away into the mouths of armed strangers who gave nothing back and threatened violence at the smallest provocation. By the spring of 1586, Pemasapan had had enough. He began to pull his people back, to stop trading, to let the English feel the hunger they had earned. Lane, the governor, decided the answer was a decapitation strike. On June 1, 1586, he arranged a parley with Pemasapan, lured him and his leading men into the open under a flag of peace, and on a prearranged signal, the watchword was, with grotesque irony, "Christ our victory," his men opened fire. Pemasapan was shot, got up, and ran for the woods. One of Lane's soldiers chased him down and came back carrying the chief's severed head. The first English colony in America had now murdered the most powerful native leader on the coast in cold blood under a false truce. Whatever fragile trust Barlow had described in 1584 was finished, and the colonists were now starving, surrounded, and hated. In a place they could not feed themselves. Then, like something out of scripture, sails appeared on the horizon. It was Sir Francis Drake, the most famous privateer alive, fresh off sacking Spanish cities in the Caribbean, swinging up the coast on his way home. He offered Lane supplies or a ship and crew to keep going, or passage home for everyone. And then the sea made the decision for them. A monstrous storm, quite possibly a full hurricane, slammed into the coast and battered Drake's fleet for days. In the chaos, ships were scattered and a vessel meant for the colonists was lost. Lane's nerve broke. He decided to abandon the colony entirely and sail home with Drake. In the panicked, storm-lashed loading, the English left men behind on shore. They also, it seems, left behind something even more haunting. Drake had hundreds of captives aboard, people he had liberated or seized during his Caribbean raids, enslaved Africans, Moors, and native people from Spanish territory. Many of them were never accounted for. They may have been put ashore on that coast and simply abandoned to their fate, a vanished population that history forgot to even ask about. The first colony left America the way it had lived there, in violence, in panic, and with people unaccounted for in the sand. And it gets stranger, because the timing was almost supernaturally cruel. Just days, perhaps 2 weeks, after Lane and the colonists fled with Drake, Grenville arrived from England with a relief fleet and fresh supplies. He found the fort empty, the colony gone, the whole expensive enterprise abandoned. Unwilling to surrender England's claim to the land, Grenville left a small holding party behind, by most accounts 15 men, with provisions enough for 2 years, and sailed home. 15 Englishmen, alone, on an island surrounded by people who now had every reason in the world to want them dead. You already know those 15 men are doomed, and you are right. But the way they vanished is the first echo of the disappearance to come. When the next colony arrived a year later, they found the fort dismantled, the houses overgrown, deer grazing peacefully inside the ruins where men had once stood guard, and one set of human bones, just one. The story they pieced together later from Mantio's people was that the holding party had been ambushed, some killed, the survivors driven off in a small boat, never seen again. So before the famous lost colony ever set foot in America, the same island had already swallowed a smaller group of Englishmen whole. The pattern was already there. Nobody read the warning, which brings us finally to 1587 and to the people whose fate has haunted this continent ever since. This colony was different, and the difference is exactly what makes it unbearable. This was not an army. Raleigh and the planners had learned, at least on paper, that a pirate garrison of soldiers could not sustain itself. So this time they sent a town, around 115 people, men, women, and children, whole families, tradesmen and farmers who had sold their lives in England to buy a stake in a new one, lured by the promise of 500 acres of American land each. They were incorporated with a charter as the City of Raleigh. They had a government with a governor and 12 assistants, and the governor they chose was a gentle, unlikely man for the job, John White, an artist. He had been on the earlier expedition as the official painter, and his delicate watercolors of native towns, fish, and plants are some of the most precious records we have of that vanished world. He was not a soldier. He was a man who came to America to draw it, and his own daughter, Eleanor, was among the colonists. She was married to Ananias Dare, one of the assistants, and she was pregnant. The plan was never to settle at Roanoke. Roanoke was cursed, and everyone knew it, exposed, sandy, surrounded by hostile towns, with poor harbors. The colonists were supposed to stop there only briefly to collect the 15 holding party men, then sail north to the deep, sheltered waters of the Chesapeake Bay and build their real city there, on rich land far from the people they had wronged. It was a good plan. It might even have worked. And here a single man, for reasons we still argue about, murdered all of it. The fleet's pilot, the navigator who actually controlled where the ships went, was a Portuguese mariner named Simon Fernandes. Fernandes was a privateer at heart, impatient to get back out to sea and hunt Spanish prizes, and he had no interest in nursing a colony up to the Chesapeake. When the ships reached Roanoke in late July of 1587, and the colonists prepared to gather the holding party and move on, Fernandes refused. He flatly announced that the season was getting late, that he would not carry them any further, and that they would be put ashore right here, on Roanoke Island, in the exact place that had already killed 2 groups of Englishmen and where every nearby native town had a blood debt to settle. White protested. It did not matter. Fernandez had the ships. The colonists were dumped on the worst possible spot in America and left to make the best of it. They had been on the island only a few days when the past came for them. One of the assistants, a man named George Howe, wandered off alone into the shallows to catch crabs, unarmed, barefoot, separated from the group. Native warriors, almost certainly connected to Wanchese, the man the English had carried to London and back. The man who had seen exactly what they were found him there in the water. They shot him with 16 arrows and then beat his skull in. The colonists found his body and understood with sickening clarity what kind of place they had been abandoned in. The land remembered what Ralph Lane and Richard Grenville had done. The bill had come due, and it did not care that these new people were carpenters and farmers and pregnant women who had personally hurt no one. Even so, they tried. They repaired the old houses, built new ones, set up a kind of normal life in an utterly abnormal situation. They had one ally left, Manteo, still loyal after years among the English, who tried to mediate with the native towns and even led the colonists on a clumsy, tragic retaliation raid that mostly succeeded in attacking a friendly village by mistake. On August 13, Manteo was baptized into the Church of England and named, by Raleigh's authority, Lord of Roanoke, the first known Protestant baptism of a Native American, a small ceremony with enormous symbolic weight. And 5 days later, on August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth, a daughter. They named her Virginia, after Virginia, the name the English had given this whole coast in honor of Elizabeth, the so-called Virgin Queen. Virginia Dare was the first English child born in the Americas. A week or so later, another colonist, Marjorie Harvey, also gave birth. 2 babies, born into a settlement that was already running out of food, already bleeding from arrow wounds, already trapped on an island it was never supposed to occupy, surrounded by enemies, with winter coming. The colonists did the math, and the math was brutal. They could not survive without resupply from England, and they could not trust Fernandez or anyone else to come back for them on time. They needed an advocate in London, someone with the authority and the personal stake to fight for ships and food and reinforcements and to make Raleigh's people honor their promises. They turned to their governor. They begged John White to sail back to England himself and return with the relief they needed to live. White did not want to go. He understood better than anyone, watching his daughter and his newborn granddaughter, that if anything happened to him or to the ships or to England, these people were finished. But the colonists insisted, and they put it in writing, signed by their own hands, so that no one could later say he had abandoned them out of cowardice. Around the end of August 1587, John White boarded a ship and sailed east, away from his family, leaving behind a granddaughter not 2 weeks old. He fully expected to be back within months. He would not see that beach again for 3 years, and when he did, there would be no one left to greet him. What happened next is one of the cruelest accidents of timing in all of history, and it is the reason 115 people died waiting for a rescue that the entire weight of world events conspired to delay. White reached England in the autumn of 1587 and immediately began fighting to organize a relief voyage. And then the largest war in Europe fell on his head. The long, cold conflict between England and Spain finally exploded into open war. King Philip II of Spain assembled the Spanish Armada, a vast invasion fleet of around 130 ships, to crush England outright. Queen Elizabeth, facing an existential threat to her kingdom, issued a stay on shipping, Every seaworthy vessel in England was needed for the defense of the realm. White could not get ships. They were all conscripted to fight the Armada. The colonists' lifeline was cut not by a storm or a battle on that distant coast, but by geopolitics 10,000 miles away that none of them could see coming. White did not give up. In the spring of 1588, he managed to scrape together 2 small pinnaces, vessels too small and unimportant to be requisitioned, called the Brave and the Roe, and loaded them with supplies and a handful of new colonists, and set sail. He never reached America. The crews, true to the privateering blood that ran through this entire enterprise, went chasing prizes on the way out and got into a sea fight with French privateers who were doing the exact same thing. The Brave was boarded and overrun. The supplies were plundered. White himself was wounded, struck in the head, struck in the side in the brawl, and the battered ships limped back to England having accomplished nothing. His granddaughter was 8 months old, and the food meant to keep her alive was now in the hold of a French pirate ship. Then the years simply slipped away. The Armada was defeated in 1588, a famous victory, but the war ground on, and shipping stayed scarce and expensive, and Raleigh's attention and money drifted to other schemes, and the men who controlled the vessels had no profit motive to sail to a poor colony with nothing to plunder. White, a man with no fortune and no fleet of his own, spent month after month, year after year, begging for passage to go rescue his own family, and could not get anyone to take him. Imagine that helplessness. Imagine knowing your daughter and your granddaughter are starving on a distant shore and being able to do absolutely nothing but write letters and plead with rich men who shrug. It took him 3 full years. 3 years of his life burned away in waiting rooms and harbors while the people he loved ran out of time. It was not until 1590 that White finally found a way back, and even then, it was only because he attached himself to a privateering expedition that happened to be heading to the Caribbean to rob Spanish ships, on the condition that they would swing by Roanoke on the way home. The colony's rescue was, to the very end, an afterthought bolted onto a pirate raid. On August 15, 1590, the ships approached the Outer Banks. That night, the men aboard saw something that lifted White's heart out of his chest, a column of smoke rising from Roanoke Island. Someone was there. Someone had a fire going. After 3 years, his family was alive. For 2 days, the weather and the treacherous shoals kept them from landing, and men drowned trying to get the boats through the surf. Finally, on the morning of August 18, 1590, Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday, John White got ashore. As the boats approached in the dark, the sailors sounded a trumpet and sang familiar English songs, calling out, hoping for an answer. There was no answer, only the surf and the wind and the dark line of trees. When the sun came up and they walked into the settlement, they found it empty, but not destroyed. That was the strangest thing of all, and it is the detail that has kept this mystery alive for 4 centuries. This was not a massacre site. There were no bodies, no skeletons strewn in the doorways, no signs of a battle, no burned houses with the dead inside. Instead, the colonists' houses had been carefully taken apart, dismantled, the timber removed, as if for transport, and a strong defensive palisade of large trees had been built around the cleared area like a fort. Someone had spent real effort here, organized effort, the kind that takes weeks and many hands. This was not the wreckage of a slaughter. It was the residue of a planned, deliberate departure. And there were the carvings. On one of the palisade posts at the entrance, cut into the bark in fair, careful Roman letters, CROATOAN. Nearby, on a tree, the partial letters CRO. And here is the part that nearly broke John White on the spot, the part that turned this from a tragedy into an unsolvable riddle. Before he had sailed away in 1587, White had made an agreement with the colonists. If they ever left Roanoke while he was gone, they were to carve the name of the place they had gone to, so he could follow them. And this is the crucial part: if they were ever forced to leave in distress, under attack, in danger, they were to carve a cross above the name as a signal of trouble. White searched that post and that tree desperately. There was no cross. The word CROATOAN was carved cleanly, calmly, without any sign of the distress signal they had agreed upon. By the colony's own prearranged code, the message was unmistakable: we have gone to CROATOAN and we left in safety, not in fear. CROATOAN was a real place and not a far one. It was the island we now call Hatteras, just to the south, the home of Mantio's people, the one native group on the whole coast that had stayed friendly to the English through all the bloodshed. It was the single most logical place for desperate, starving colonists to go, to the people who had a reason to help them and a leader, Mantio, who was one of their own assistants. White had his answer carved right there in the wood. His family had gone to CROATOAN. All he had to do was sail a few miles south and find them. He never made it. This is the moment that should make you want to scream at a 400-year-old corpse. As the men were preparing to sail to CROATOAN, another storm rolled in off the Atlantic. The ships were undersupplied, anchor cables were snapping, and they had already lost anchors in the rough water. The privateer captains, who had only ever cared about Spanish gold and were now low on food and patience, refused to risk their vessels nosing around the killer shoals of the Outer Banks looking for a colony that might or might not be a few miles down the coast. They overruled White completely. They would sail to the Caribbean to resupply and raid, and come back for CROATOAN in better weather. White, a passenger with no power and no ship of his own, could do nothing but watch the coast where his family had carved their destination shrink away behind him as the ships turned for open ocean. The plan to return never happened. The weather, the war, and the indifference of men chasing money carried John White back across the Atlantic, and he never saw the New World again. He spent his last years in Ireland, a broken man, writing down everything he had seen so the record would survive him, knowing he had stood within a few miles of the answer and been dragged away from it. He died never knowing what became of his daughter Eleanor or his granddaughter Virginia. The word was right there. He just could not reach it. So what actually happened to them? For 400 years, that question has obsessed historians, archaeologists, novelists, con artists, and amateur sleuths, and the honest answer is that we still do not know for certain. But we are closer now than White ever was, and the leading explanations are far more interesting than the ghost stories. The most straightforward reading is the one carved on the post. They went to CROATOAN. They abandoned the failing Roanoke site, dismantled their houses for the lumber, and moved south to Hatteras Island to live with Mantio's people, the CROATOAN, who could feed and shelter them. Over the following years and decades, with no relief ever arriving from England, the survivors simply blended into the native community, intermarried, had children, adopted a new way of life, and ceased to be English in any way the records could track. This is not a wild theory. In 1709, an English explorer named John Lawson visited the Hatteras people and reported that they told him their ancestors included white people who could talk in a book, read, and that gray eyes appeared among them, which was unheard of in unmixed native populations. Lawson believed he was looking at the descendants of the lost colony, and modern archaeology has put hard evidence under his story. Excavations on Hatteras Island, led by archaeologist Mark Horton and the local CROATOAN Archaeological Society, have pulled English artifacts of exactly the right period out of native village layers. A fragment of a writing slate with letters still on it, parts of a rapier, gun hardware, worked metal, all found mixed directly with native pottery and tools. The physical signature of two peoples living together as one. But it gets more complicated, because there is strong evidence that the colonists did not all go to the same place. Many researchers now think the group split. While some went south to CROATOAN, others may have gone northwest, deeper inland, to the mainland near the western end of Albemarle Sound. This idea got a stunning boost in 2012, when researchers at the British Museum examined one of John White's own maps of the region, a beautiful watercolor called La Virginia Pars. On the map, they noticed two small patches where the paper had been corrected, covered over. When they shone light through the paper, a hidden symbol appeared underneath one of the patches, a four-pointed star in red and blue, the kind of symbol used to mark a fort. Someone, possibly White himself, had marked a planned fort site at exactly this inland location, on the Chowan River near Salmon Creek, and then deliberately hidden it. Archaeologists from the First Colony Foundation excavated that area, dubbed Site X, and found fragments of a specific kind of English pottery, Surrey-Hampshire border ware, that was used in this exact period and would not have been traded to natives. It is the kind of everyday dish a colonist would eat off of. It suggests a small group of the lost colonists really did live there, inland, for some time. And then there is the darkest possibility, the one the survivors of Jamestown wrote down 20 years later. When England finally planted its successful colony at Jamestown in 1607, just up the coast in the Chesapeake, the very region the lost colony had been trying to reach all along, the new settlers were under standing orders to look for the lost people. What they heard was grim. The English chronicler William Strachey recorded a report that a group of the Roanoke colonists had lived for years among friendly natives near the Chesapeake Bay, and that around the time the Jamestown settlers arrived in 1607, the great paramount chief Powhatan, the father of Pocahontas, had ordered them slaughtered, fearing the arrival of more Englishmen. John Smith of Jamestown also collected reports of survivors and rumors of native towns where people lived in two-story houses of stone and wore European clothes. The evidence here is thin, second-hand, and tangled, and historians fight bitterly over how much to trust it. But it raises the possibility that at least some of the colonists survived for 2 decades only to be wiped out at the precise moment that rescue, in the form of Jamestown, finally arrived on the same coast. 20 years of waiting ended weeks too late. There were other answers too, including a famous fraud. In 1937, a man turned up claiming to have found a carved stone near the Chowan River, supposedly written by Eleanor Dare herself, describing the deaths of the colonists, including her husband and her daughter Virginia. It caused a sensation. Then more stones appeared, dozens of them, scattered across several states, telling an ever more elaborate story, until investigators traced them and concluded that nearly all of them were a hoax, probably manufactured for money. The Dare stones became a cautionary tale about how badly people wanted this mystery solved, badly enough to invent the ending themselves. The first stone is still occasionally debated, but the rest poisoned the well for decades. Strip away the frauds and the legends, and what the best evidence now suggests is almost certainly the least dramatic and the most human answer of all. The lost colony was probably never a single event with a single grave. The colonists, abandoned and starving, did the only sensible thing desperate people can do. They scattered. They split into smaller groups and went to live with the native peoples who would take them in south to CROATOAN, west to the mainland, perhaps north toward the Chesapeake. They survived not by conquering the land, as their soldiers had tried and failed to do, but by giving up on being conquerors and becoming part of the people they had once treated as enemies. They married. had children, and dissolved into the very communities the English colonial project was built to displace. Their descendants may well have walked this coast for generations, carrying English ancestry in native families, until disease, war, and time scattered them further. There may be people alive today, in North Carolina and beyond, who carry the blood of Virginia Dare and never know it. The Lost Colony DNA Project is, right now, trying to trace exactly those genetic threads, comparing modern families to what little we know of the colonists, still hunting for the ending that John White was dragged away from in 1590. Here is why this matters to you, why a few dozen English settlers who vanished 400 years before you were born should keep you up at night. The Roanoke colonists were not fools, and they were not weak. They had a plan, a charter, a government, supplies, an ally, and the backing of the wealthiest people in their country. They did almost everything a group of people can do to survive. And they were destroyed anyway, not by one disaster, but by a cascade of ordinary failures that nobody could see lining up in advance. One greedy pilot who would not sail a little further. One war breaking out at the wrong moment 10,000 miles away. One storm too many. One captain who valued plunder over people. None of these things on their own was extraordinary. Stack them together, and they erased an entire community so thoroughly that we are still arguing about the corpse. Every settlement, every society, every safe and ordinary life, including yours, rests on a stack of small things going right that you never think about. And the Roanoke colonists are the proof of what happens when, just once, the stack falls the wrong way. And there is the other thing, the human thing, the part that has nothing to do with history lessons. Somewhere on that coast, on the morning of August 18, 1590, a little girl was turning 3 years old, if she was alive at all. Her name was Virginia. Her grandfather had crossed an entire ocean to find her, had spent 3 years of his life fighting for the chance, and stood within a few miles of where her people had carved their destination into a tree. He could read the word. He just could not reach her. The ships turned for open sea, and the coast went quiet behind them, and that word stayed carved in the wood, weathering in the salt wind, spelling out an answer that nobody would follow for 400 years. CROATOAN. They told us where they went. We simply never managed to go and bring them home.